Okay, today we're in John the 13th chapter. Last week we were in John the 13th chapter. And today we will be finishing it up. But where we are today, as we're taking the last week in Jesus' life, we've now come down to the last day in Jesus' life. This would be our Thursday as we know it. And it's going to be the last night that Jesus lives. He's going to establish his Passover supper, and we'll look at that some more of this, especially next week. He's going to be having a meal, and as he's having this meal and getting his supper, remember it is the Passover supper, and this is where he will institute his Lord's Supper, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. Now, I've got those scriptures down there because in this particular section, John tells the story, but also Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same stories. So we can go back and forth and we can look at those scriptures and try to get the whole story. Now, when we talk about the last week in the life of Jesus, let's look at it in this way. Jesus is now going down to Jerusalem for 3 Passovers. That means, or actually 4 Passovers he's going. That means he has been preaching for 3 years. Now, after he goes down this time in the Passover in John chapter 13, verse 1, we learned that Passover is a one-day feast. The Passover feast always happens on the 14th day of the first Jewish month. And then, starting on the 15th day, the very next day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins, and it goes for 7 days. But during the Passover, on the 14th day, you couldn't have any unleavened bread that day either. So there's going to be 8 days that you can't have any unleavened bread. And so the Jews then looked at this feast really as one big 8-day feast. Sometimes they called it the Feast of the Passover. Sometimes they called it the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you see them as you read in your Bible interchanged in there. Now again, another thing that we need to remember is that Jewish time was counted differently than our time, what we count today. Now, when Jesus institutes this supper tonight, this is going to be what would be Thursday evening, our time. Now, we measure time according to the way Romans measured time back in those days. You know how that is, from midnight to midnight. But they measured time from sunset to sunset. So what they would find is that at about 6 o'clock on Thursday, that's when their Friday would begin. And then 6 o'clock on their Friday, that's when their Saturday would begin. And on down the line. So they went from evening to evening. We go from midnight to midnight. They would go from evening to evening, and that evening generally started close to 6 o'clock in the evening. So there where that little blue is that I put there, we're down on Thursday evening now. Jesus is getting ready to eat the Passover, institute the Lord's Supper on Thursday evening. He will be arrested then and put to death the next day on that Friday. All right, now we go back to John's account. And we want to look at what Jesus is doing here at this Last Supper. Last week we closed with this verse. We closed with them all around the table, the Passover table, and said, he arose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself, and after that he poured water in a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Now he's shocked, because this is an act which was the most humble of all acts you had in the first century time. Any time that a visitor came to a home in the first century, why the owner of the home would invite them in, and instead of asking for their coat to hang it up, they would have a basin there and they would wash their feet. Because they didn't have shoes like we had, they wore sandals, and they walked everywhere, and so their feet was always dirty after a trip. So the master of the house generally would call in his servant and have the servant to, instead of taking coats, to wash feet. So the big thing to remember is, this was the most humble act that you could do in first century time. That was to go down and wash a person's feet. Now there was a purpose for that, as we will learn it, learn about the purpose here. It was really to get their feet clean because their feet was all dirty. All right, John continues now with the washing of Jesus' feet. We talked somewhat about this last week, so let's now put it together today. Jesus answered and said unto him, now this is where Peter said, are you going to wash my feet? He said, what? And you notice I've emphasized that. What I am doing, you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Now I want you to keep that in mind because that's very important. Jesus said, what I'm doing now, you do not understand. Well, think about it. Everybody knew what Jesus was doing. He was washing feet. He had washed people's feet, come to Peter. He was washing feet. So when Jesus said, what I am doing now, you do not understand, this is to catch their attention. In essence, this is saying, yeah, I'm washing your feet, but that's not what I'm really doing. I'm doing something else. And in doing this other thing, washing feet is just part of it. So, what I'm doing, you don't understand. Peter said unto him, well, you'll never wash my feet. In other words, I will never let you humble yourself, Lord, down underneath me to wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part of me. Okay, Peter, if you're not going to let me do what I ask you to do, you're not going to have any part of me. Well, then Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. In other words, if that's it, if letting you wash my feet will make me part of you, just give me a bath everywhere. Just wash my hands and wash my head. In other words, Peter is trying to tell him, I want to be a part of you. And if this washing is what makes me a part of you, then I want to be a part of you. But Peter so far has missed the point, like Jesus said. You don't understand. Jesus said unto him, he who is bathed needs only his feet to wash. Now this gives you the reason why he's washing feet. Jesus says, I'm washing the feet, not your head, not your hands. I'm washing your feet because your feet are dirty. But since you guys have bathed, you're clean everywhere except your feet, which would be dirty from this trip. He says, it's only feet, but it's completely clean, and you are clean, Peter. So he's telling him, but not all of you. Now, we're going to get into where Jesus is starting to zero in on Judas betraying him. He says, the first thing, you're clean, but not all of you. Now, I suppose at this time they would come to the mind, they would think, okay, one of us must not have taken a bath. That's probably what he's talking about as he's looking here. So when he had washed their feet, well, it goes ahead and it says he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, you're not all clean. So he knew he's starting now to work on Judas. And we're going to talk about that this morning, how he works on Judas's conscience, how he does all of these things in so many ways. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Now, put that together up there with his first statement. What I am doing, you do not understand now. So he's telling them, what I am doing, you do not understand. When he got through, he said, now do you know what I've done to you? Well, of course, the answer was, you've washed our feet. That's all that they could see at this time. But he's told them, I'm doing more than washing your feet. Now, I'm pressing this because always somewhere there are people that say we need to wash feet in our services. So when we come together, you'd have a basin of water. People go by. You would sit down, and then we'd wash your feet. Well, when they do that, of course, they come in with clean feet that they've just washed, clean socks on. They take them off. Everything is clean. But the people washing feet, they wash feet in there because Jesus told them to wash feet. Now, this is not what he's saying. That's what I am zeroing in on. Jesus is saying, what I've done, you don't understand. And they understood he was talking about washing feet. So do you know what I've done to you? So then he now is going to explain it. He said, you call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. I meant, I am your teacher, I am your Lord. If then your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example that you should do as, I want you to notice that word, as I have done to you. Not what? He's washed their feet, but he's done something else. He said, now I want you to take this lesson, this example. I've given you an example so that you can do as I have done to you. Then he explains. He gives them the key so they can interpret it. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, what things? These things. What things? Well, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he sent greater than who sent him. I want you to understand who is the greatest. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Now, what are these things? These things is, I've given you an example. You have seen me, your Lord and your teacher, and nobody rises above their Lord or their teacher. I'm your Lord or your teacher. And I have given you an example that you should do as I have done. You need to serve one another. You need to be humble. You need to learn that attitude of service is what Jesus is teaching them. So that was the purpose of washing their feet. Now, the disciples think he is about to establish his kingdom. So this happens at various times in their life. They get to thinking, boy, something big is getting ready to happen, and so here they think he's getting ready to establish their kingdom. Now, instead of Jesus' example provoking a discussion on service and humility, it did exactly the opposite. They began talking about who would be greatest. So instead of them saying, wow, okay, and then start talking about humility, they started arguing about who would be the greatest of them, and we learned that from Luke. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. I've always thought I'd like to hear that and hear what they said. I mean, Peter would say, I should be the greatest because, and I just wonder what he said, what cause there was. When John or James said, no, I think I should be the greatest. What reasoning did they give? But they were discussing. Then Jesus said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors, because they're the ones that benefit. Not so among you. On the contrary, who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. So you see, Jesus' teaching continues on. Jesus provokes a question. He does something, washes their feet, says, you don't know what I'm doing. Then he gets through and he said, now you do as I have done. And then he tells them about the greater, just mentions it, that I'm greater than you are. Okay, instead of them doing what we think they should do, say, well, okay then, they immediately jump in, okay, which one of us is going to be the greatest in the kingdom? See? And this is going to give Jesus an opportunity to continue his teaching, the same teaching. So he says, but you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So, Jesus, first of all, cuts their legs out from under them. He said, the greatest among you is going to be the one who serves the most. That will be the greatest. Now that obviously is not what they wanted to hear. But he made it plain. That's what he is teaching. The one who serves the most is the greatest. And I have given you an example. But, you 12, I want you to know you are going to be great. I want you to know that great things are going to happen to you. He said, now, those of you who continued with me in my trials, I bestow upon you a kingdom. Just as the Father bestowed upon me a kingdom. Now, I'm going to give you a kingdom. Kingdom means ruleship. You guys are going to be in a place of ruling. Now, just a minute ago, he says, nope, if you are in a place of ruling here, you're a benefactor and all of this. He said, the greatest are the servants. Now then he said, but I want you to know you're going to be in a place of ruling. And he said, my Father gave me a kingdom that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. Now he's bringing up the kingdom subject himself. You guys are going to eat and drink with me in my kingdom. Now this can only mean one thing. And that is that Jesus is going to establish his kingdom on the day of Pentecost. Then, after he does that, then the Lord's Supper, of which he's getting ready to establish, will be something that they partake of every week. And as they partake of it, they're going to eat and drink in the kingdom. And Jesus said, I'll be eating and drinking with you. Now, obviously, that is a spiritual thing. Jesus is in heaven, but he's eating and drinking in his kingdom. He's watching us. He is taking part of it as we today. You're going to eat with me in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So you 12 guys are going to sit on judgment thrones, and you're going to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. You're going to be the ones who control, who give the laws and force the laws to be obeyed. You're going to be the lawgivers here among the 12 tribes of Israel. Now again, they don't know what this is talking about. You and I wouldn't know what it's talking about if it wasn't for other passages of Paul and so forth talking. And that is that you remember that Jesus has already told Peter, he said, I'll give unto you the keys of the kingdom, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall already have been bound in heaven, and vice versa about silence. In other words, you guys are going to be the 12 who sets forth the laws of the kingdom. And you will be the judges of the 12 tribes. These tribes of Israel. Israel will be God's people. You are going to become the rulers of God's people. Well, how will this happen? The same way it's happening right here today. We're going to be able to pick up our Bible, and as we pick up the New Testament, where did it come from? How did we get it? We got it through those men, and that's going to be our judge of whatever it is. If we have a conflict today, you say yes, I say no. We go here, and whatever they say is the final word. So that's what Jesus is saying. And he's telling them, you guys don't understand yet, but you will. And you will be leaders. But if you want to be great, you have to serve. Who will be the greatest? The greatest servant. Are we going to be rulers? Yes, you are. But what kind of rulers? You're going to be rulers that serve, servants, just like Jesus did in that day. Now, he teaches them a lesson with foot washing. Now Matthew they come to the discussion about the betrayal. In this, before Jesus is starting to institute his Lord's Supper, all four Gospels say Jesus began to talk about being betrayed. Now, as we start this, we must remember Judas has already made arrangements with the rulers to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. It's already been done. Jesus knows it, and Judas knows it. Judas has the silver in his pocket, and now they're sitting down. Nobody else knows this. So keep that in mind as we see how they talk about it. Matthew said, now when even was come, he was sitting at meat with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, now this would be the Passover meal that they're eating. He said, verily I say unto you that one of you shall betray me. Now that's shocking. And from here on, I want you to notice how much more shocking it's going to become. I want you to notice the attitude and disposition of Jesus and what he does. And then the attitude and disposition of Judas and what he does. It's very interesting. And they were exceeding sorrowful and began to say to him, everyone, is it I, Lord? Nobody but Judas knows who it is. So they say, is it I? And then Jesus answered and said, he that dippeth his hands with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. Now, last week we gave you this picture, and this is the way that they ate their dinners. They reclined. There would be a couch there where you see these guys reclining, and they reach over to a table in between, and they would pick things up and they would eat. But one man's back would be in the front of the next person as they would go through in this way. Well, if you've got 12 guys around a table, it's going to take more than one bowl of gravy, as they would have it out there in the middle. Now, what they would do is they would set a bowl of gravy like stew, and then they would have bread, and they would reach over with their bread, dip it in the stew, and then eat it. And they call that a sop. That's what they called it. Now, there would be 3 or 4 of these bowls out there. Now, what this is saying is, he that dippeth his hands with me in the dish. So here it is. There would be a bowl Jesus was using, and probably 3 other guys using the same bowl. And Jesus said, he that dippeth his hands with me in the dish, now he's zeroing it in. It's going to be in this section right here. And he said, the Son of Man goeth, even as it is written of him, but woe unto that man to whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it for that man had he not been born. Now Jesus is making a warning. This warning is for Judas. Woe to that man that's going to betray me. It had been better for him if he had never been born. He's trying to get Judas to stop and think. The Son of Man goeth, even as it is written of him, but woe unto that man whom the Son of Man is betrayed. In there. And Judas, who betrayed him, answered and said, is it I, Rabbi? And he said to him, you have said it. So now here, Judas looks at him. All the 12 says, is it I? Judas says, is it I? And he said, you said it. which means it is exactly what you said. It is you. And so he pointed out Judas. Now, each one of these writers is going to tell us this story. We're going to put them all together here. So he pointed out to Judas, that's what it is. Now, Mark tells us, in the evening he came with the 12. Now as he sat and ate, Jesus said, "Surely I say unto you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." And they began to be sorrowful and say to him, "Is it I?" And he answered, "One of the 12 who dips with me in the dish," same we've read. "The Son of Man goeth just as it was written of him. Woe to him," just as we've read. So Matthew and Mark are just almost the same material. Luke says, "Likewise also, he also took the cup after supper, saying, the cup in the new covenant is my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table." So Judas would have been dipping at the same time Jesus was dipping. He's zeroing in on it a little bit more. Then they began to question among themselves which it was then. Then we come to John. And John now is telling us, and he gives us a little more information here. This is the material we've already just studied, of where John says, Jesus started out and said, all of you are not clean. One of you is not clean. Now, John continues on to tell the story. "I do not speak," Jesus said, "I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me." This is a prophecy that would happen to the Messiah. "Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, that you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly I say unto you, he who receives whomsoever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me." So he said, "Now I have predicted this. I have told you before it happened. I am telling you that it's the guy right here that's sitting here among us, so that you'll understand that I knew all along." And then he said, "Now I surely say to you," I'm going to tell you something now, "whosoever receives me receives him who sent me." So now he's telling these disciples, now one of you are getting ready to betray me. I want you to understand that it would be better for that man had he never been born. But I also want you to understand, whosoever receives me, believes me, receives the God who sent me, is what he's saying. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in the spirit and testified and said, "Most assuredly I say unto you, one of you will betray me." So over again he makes a statement. Verse 23, "Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved." Now this disciple whom Jesus loved, everybody I've ever read said it has to be John, because the way John talks. John never mentions himself. He always mentions others, but he never mentions himself, and it fits him that's in there. So evidently, it was Peter here, and then right behind him would be John that would be there. Remember what we got right there? You look at the guy, and then the person behind him would be John, and then the one behind them would be Jesus. So it'd be hard to tell than what he's saying. So, leaning back, Peter leans back and asked him, said, who is it? And then leaning back on Jesus' breast, John would have leaned back and said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." Now just stop to think. He has over and over said, "One of you will betray me." He's sitting at this section of the table with me. He's eating out of the same bowl that I'm eating out of. And now, I want you to know, it's the man that I take this piece of bread, I'm going to dip it in there and give it to him. That's the man. Wow. How he zeroed it in. Jesus said there, It is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Now let's stop. Think about that for just a moment. Here it is, he handed it to Judas. And after he handed him to Judas, Satan entered into Judas' heart. Now we already told Satan had entered his heart before, and he had made preparations, an agreement to betray Jesus. What would this mean? It would mean this. Judas has done a horrible deed. He has the money in his pocket. He has an opportunity to get out. He could stop and say, Lord, it is I, and here's what I have done, and he could fall on his knees and cry and ask Jesus to forgive him. That's one option. The other one is he has been caught. And Jesus said, whatever you do, do quickly. In other words, make up your mind, which is it going to be? Whatever it is, do it now. Now, that was kind of Jesus. That wasn't mean. Jesus is not going to let Judas sit there and think about it and think about it and think about it and think about it. He has been caught red-handed. This is the perfect time for him to come clean and admit what he's done. And that's what Jesus is making him do. He said, whatever you do, do it now. Do it quickly. Make up your mind right now. And see, what shall I do? The money or Jesus? And immediately he decided, I'll take the money. That's the way it happened. But no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought because Judas had the money box that Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that we should give something to the poor. So nobody understood why Jesus is telling him to do it and do quickly. And having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately, and it was night. So he took the bread. Whatever you're going to do quickly. Judas jumped up and walked out into the night. It has now been set. He will lead them to Jesus to be put to death the next day. Class dismissed.